Well, hello all again. So I'm going to start off this week. I'm just going to dive right in, right? I'm going to start off this week by asking a question, and I want you to think about this for a second. Have you ever said something and had it taken out of context? Have you ever had something that you have said taken out of context? Now, if you're a parent, you definitely have. Because all statements are eternal statements in the ears of a child, right? I mean, if you tell a kid that they can kick their sibling out of their room while they're changing or getting dressed, you can bet that your kid just heard that they now have the right to kick their sibling out of their room whenever they want to. That's just what they hear. That's just how it works. They aren't going to remember the context of what you said. They're just going to remember what you said, and they're going to use it whenever they feel like it, right? But we all know that context matters. It should matter. See, like if I were to shout, "Move!" at somebody at the grocery store, that's going to be considered really rude, right? But if I shout, "Move!" at somebody who's about to have like a wall collapse on them or who's about to be hit by a car, that would be considered kind of heroic, right? I mean, context is really, really important. So today we're going to be talking about a parable. We're continuing our series on parables. And this particular parable, it's important to understand the context. So we're going to be looking a little bit at that. This week's parable is a kingdom of heaven parable, or more accurately, it's one of the parables of the present kingdom. Now, some parables focus on the coming kingdom, the eschaton, the end of all things. These parables talk about the promises of the Hebrew scriptures and particularly of the prophets, and they say that they are present now. The parables of the present kingdom talk about how these promises are present now, that they have begun with the actions and words of Jesus. So this week's parable, the parable of the wheat and the weeds, sometimes called the wheat and the tares, is one of a series of parables called the parables of the present kingdom. One of them is found in Matthew 4. It's the parable of the growing seed, but the rest of them are found in chapter 13 of Matthew. So we've got the parable of the wheat and the weeds, and then we've got the parable of the mustard seed, the parable of the yeast, and then we have the explanation of the wheat and the weeds. And then we have two more little parables, the parable of the hidden treasure and the parable of the pearl. All of these are the parables of the present kingdom. So if you have not had a chance to read the parable of the wheat and the weeds, I'm going to encourage you to go ahead and do that now. So that's found in Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 through 30. And then the explanation is found in verse 36 through 43. So if you haven't had a chance to read that, go ahead and read that now. Okay, we'll dive right in. Now, this parable has the distinction of being perhaps the most misused of all of Jesus's parables and teachings. Super fun, right? The most misused. Now, some have looked at this and applied it to the individual to answer the question of what to do with the problem of individual sin, that mixture of good and evil that you find in yourself, in oneself. In this instance, it's been used almost to argue against sanctification, or that effort to root out sin in one's life. Just let the weeds and the wheat grow together and we'll just worry about, separating it out at the harvest. It's fine. It's fine. Obviously this kind of lands in some wonky territory, right? Luckily, that interpretation hasn't been widely adopted, but there is another interpretation of this parable that shows up more frequently, and that's in the context of church discipline. So that uses this to answer the question of what to do with the mixture of good and evil that we find within the church. So in the early church, this was used to argue against reprimanding or excommunicating false teachers who were teaching Christians things other than the teachings of Jesus, that were actually encouraging others to sin. These people that argued for this interpretation of this parable argued that judgment will happen at the end of all things, and that we should therefore remain passive and just kind of do nothing and let the wheat and the weeds grow together until the end of all things. Now, this is really confusing when you compare it and you read it alongside the teachings of Jesus on church discipline that we find in Matthew 18 that we went over a few weeks ago, where Jesus talks about the need to cut people off who refuse correction for causing others to stumble. When you read these two things alongside each other, it gets really confusing. Now, a lot of the confusion on how to interpret this parable is largely due to context and misinterpreting the purpose of the parable. Now, we as modern readers, we understandably read this parable and seek to apply it directly to ourselves. We come to it with our own questions and with our own situations, and we look to it to offer truth that can be applied to our lives. But we often forget that Jesus originally taught this parable to a completely different group of people who had their own questions and had their own concerns. His purpose in telling this parable is not necessarily the same as our purpose in reading it. But if we really want to understand what this parable is saying, if we really want to be able to apply the parable as Jesus intended for us to apply it, we have to put this parable back in its context. So, to better understand the questions and the concerns that Jesus was seeking to address in this parable, let's dive in a little into the context of first century Palestine. Now, as many of you know, the Israelites were under Roman rule. Rome was ruling over them. Now, they had various foreign rulers for many generations, and they were eager to have Israel be its own sovereign nation once more. I mean, ever since they were sent into exile in Babylon, they had been dreaming about what it would be like for Israel to be its own sovereign nation again. There were many prophecies about a Messiah who would come to the nation of Israel and reestablish the kingdom again. So for the Jews of Jesus's day, they were looking for that Messiah to come in this really dramatic fashion and to overthrow the government, to bring judgment to their oppressors, and to purge Jerusalem and the surrounding areas of sinners and unrighteous people. So when Jesus appears, he doesn't look a whole lot like what they thought the Messiah would look like. He doesn't meet their expectations. Even though he does fulfill many prophecies, he's not what they had pictured. And this left many wondering what's going on. See, that's what actually we see in Matthew chapter 11, when John the Baptist sends his disciples to Jesus asking, "Are you the one that was to come, or should we expect someone else?" See, John had been preparing the way for Jesus to come as the Messiah, but Jesus doesn't quite fit the image that any of them had in their head of what the Messiah would be. There's no flashes of lightning. There's no purifying the nation. There's no overthrowing the government. So when Jesus is preaching to the people that the kingdom of heaven is here, those expectations of the Messiah, of what the kingdom of heaven would look like, those are forming the backdrop of this message. So in this parable of the present kingdom, Jesus is answering the unspoken question of, how can the kingdom be here if it doesn't look like what we expected? And in this particular parable, Jesus is answering the specific question of, how can this be the kingdom if evil is still present? How can this be the kingdom if evil is still present? Now, that's a valid question for the Jews of Jesus's day, and that's a valid question in our day as well. Many of us have probably wondered, why is there so much evil in the world? Why do people who do bad things seem to prosper? While we don't have all of those prophecies of the Messiah who come, to overthrow the government and vanquish the powers of evil, we don't have all of those things floating in our head, right? We do sense that the world is not as it should be. We look around and we see the effects of racism, of greed, of power, and of oppression. This parable speaks to that reality and to those questions. So, with this context in mind, let's talk about the primary teachings of this parable. There are two. First, the kingdom of heaven is present and active, even though evil is still present and judgment hasn't taken place yet. It's present, it's active, it's here, even though evil is still here and judgment hasn't taken place yet. This kind of returns us to that concept we talked about several weeks ago of now and not yet. The kingdom is both now and not yet. Those good seeds of the kingdom of heaven have been planted in the world. The gospel of Jesus is producing dramatic transformation in the lives of individuals. And if you read the parable of the wheat and the weeds and then read through the explanation you read, if you read it in the middle, there's the parable of the yeast. That gospel is like yeast. It's working its way through the dough of the world. It may not be super flashy, but it's doing its work, and it's producing all sorts of fruit along the way. The kingdom of heaven is now. But the kingdom is not complete yet. It's not harvest time yet. It has started, but we must wait for the consummation of all things for the kingdom of God to fully live into all those promises that we see in the Hebrew scriptures or that we see in the book of Revelation, where there is no more death, no more mourning, no more crying, no more pain, where evil is vanquished for good, and where we are all gathered together from every tribe and tongue and nation to worship our God and King. It's both now and not yet. The kingdom of heaven is present, even though evil is here and judgment hasn't happened yet. So that's number one, primary teaching number one. Primary teaching number two, judgment will happen. Now, this is intended as both a warning and a promise. It's a warning to each of us that we need to change our actions and get our house in order. We need to root out all evil in ourselves because judgment, it might be delayed until the consummation of all things, but it's still definitely going to happen. It's a warning. It's going to happen. It's also a promise. It's a promise that evil will not go unchecked forever. When it seems like the world is just too broken to ever be redeemed, that greed and power and selfishness and oppression, they're just too strong, we remember that God will not let evil have its way forever. He promises to judge. He promises to hold those weeds accountable for the pain and destruction that they have brought all of the wheat around them. He promises to judge. Judgment will happen. So there's a couple things I want you to notice in this parable. First, not all of the actions in the world, in this parable, can be attributed to God. There's somebody else, right, that's acting. There's an adversary that plants the weeds. It's not God plants wheat and weeds. There's an adversary at work. When we look at the world around us, we look at, natural disasters or, failed ventures or things like COVID-19. Not necessarily all of these things are judgment from God on a rebellious person or a rebellious people. Some of these things are the product of an adversary. Some of these things are the adversary distorting God's good creation and sowing discord and chaos into the world. Now, on the flip side, not every failure or trial or hardship is a deliberate attack on the righteous ones by Satan. Sometimes God uses these things to discipline his beloved children. So, how can we tell whether something is from God or whether something is a product of the adversary? Well, it's kind of hard to tell without the fruit. This parable talks about the wheat and the weeds. The weeds in this particular case are very likely a plant either called tares, which is why some translations say the wheat and the tares, or a plant called darnel, both of which, all three, wheat, tares, and darnel, they all look very similar. They differ only in a few millimeters of width in the stem and the leaves. It's only until the fruit arrives that you can really see the difference between these plants. So when you look at these circumstances, and you even look at people around you, look for the fruit to be able to tell, is it from God or is it from an adversary? Look for the fruit. Another thing to notice in this parable is that the wheat and the weeds, they are all together in the world. Now, as Christians, we've often tried to retreat into our kind of little enclaves and cut off contact with the outside world. Maybe we see those that are not in our Christian community, right? Maybe we see them at the store, or we pass them in the halls at school or at work, but we don't actually interact with them. We don't actually interact with the world. That's not right. That's not as it's intended to be. We need to stay in the world. When you read this parable, you see that God is not concerned about the weeds damaging the wheat in the situation. He's not concerned about that. He just says, well, I'll sort it out at the end. He's not worried that the weeds are going to hurt or harm the wheat. And so if he's not concerned about it, we probably shouldn't be either. So, action steps. My challenges for all of you. I've got 2 of them this week. First, stay in the world. The kingdom is active in the world, and God chooses to use the church and all of its many members to further that kingdom. To have an effect on the world, we have to remain connected, in contact with the world. We have to remain in the world, but not of it, right? Now, if you have no relationships with those outside a Christian community, whether that's this community or any other church, if you have no friends or relationships with people that aren't in church on a Sunday morning, I challenge you to seek out relationships. Maybe that's inviting a coworker for coffee. Maybe that's inviting a neighbor to dinner, or I guess a socially distanced backyard ice cream thing. I don't know. But seek out relationships with those that are not in the Christian community. Because true disciples make other disciples. That's a requirement. It's not an optional thing that we do. True disciples make other disciples. So how are you seeking to spread God's love and God's truth to the world around you? I want you to think about this week. Think about that this week. And if you have no relationships with those outside a Christian community, I want to challenge you to take steps towards relationship. Have a conversation. Have a coffee with people. Okay, so that's number 1. Stay in the world. My second challenge or action step for you this week is to root out the evil in yourself, because judgment is coming. It's not something we like to talk about, but judgment is coming. It's not our job to judge the world around us, no matter how much we want to, right? It's not the job of the wheat to judge the weeds. We don't get to do that. God will judge. This parable offers us a promise that God will judge. God will judge the world and all of those that wreak havoc and destruction and pain. It also warns that God will judge you. Make sure that you are in the camp that sows love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, and self-control. All of those fruits of the Spirit. Get rid of anything in you that produces any other fruit. Now, if you're having trouble figuring out what those things might be, I want to remind you that God is gracious and God will give awareness of our sin if we ask Him. We just have to ask. And we ask God to give you the eyes to see what needs to be rooted out of you and give you the courage to take steps to get rid of that stuff. So, stay in the world, and root out all that is evil within you. Those are my challenges and action steps for you this week. I'm going to finish by saying this. The kingdom of heaven is present. Even though there is evil and there is pain in the world, the kingdom of heaven is present. And there is a promise that God will step in and God will finish the work that he started in the life and death and resurrection of his son, Jesus Christ. And he will put all things right again. He will put all things right. This is our hope. This is our anchor. Hold to that. Those who have ears, let them hear. Amen. Blessings.